Hi, William Ibanez here, creator of Blazing Quantum, and as a patron supporter, I'm helping to bring this episode. Why don't you become a patron supporter as well?
This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Planet's Omnibus Volume 1 and Ding Dong Circus. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys talking about manga. And on the December episode of the series, we're going to be discussing the first omnibus volumes of Planets by Makoto Yukimura. And then after that, we're going to discuss Ding Dong Circus by Sasaki Maki. But before we get to those books, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. And we're in the final day, when this episode goes up, of December. So head on over there right now and get those specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often the discounts will be more impressive than that.
Yeah, if you were here at the tail end of December, but if you still got time to order things like the Rurouni Kenshin Viz Big Editions for 30% off. And I know Star Wars is really hot right now, and you can get those really weird Star Wars manga from the late 90s at 50% off.
You just can't get enough Star Wars in life, as we've learned these past couple of weeks. No. So whether it's manga or any other kind of comics, you can't go wrong by going to Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. Check them out for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your manga there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. And you know, Shea, we also have another sponsor for the podcast, and this one is Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great place to get coffee, tea, and chocolates. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade grown, and organic certified. And also, it's roasted to order. It's roasted in small batches, no mass production, and there is no minimum order. So if you go to the website, justcoffee.coop, that's justcoffee, one word, .coop, and put various items in your shopping cart before you check out, please be sure to use our coupon code COMICS. What that'll do is give you 10% off of your order, and on top of that, you don't have to pay for shipping. So this is great coffee. They do great things. This is a cooperative, so not only will you be drinking great coffee, but you'll also be drinking responsibly. That's justcoffee.coop, and use our coupon code COMICS when you check out. Shea, that's new since you've been on the show, the Just Coffee Co-op sponsorship.
That is, and I haven't gotten a chance to have some of this coffee. But you were telling me it was pretty good. And
yeah, it is. It is very good, and it's they have a variety of different blends. And I found out about them by listening to some other podcasts that have them as a sponsor. And in fact, some of the bigger podcasts like Mark Maron's WTF and Sam Cedar's Majority Report, they have their own blends at Just Coffee Co-op. Now, we're not that big yet, but maybe someday we can aspire to the Comics Alternative blend.
Maybe. But, every year for Christmas, someone gets me some coffee. So, I really love the stuff. So I'll have to give it a shot.
Yeah, definitely check it out. And plus you feel good about getting the coffee there because they do great things. It's fair trade, organic, all of that.
Yeah, it sounds like a great place to get coffee. But
Yep.
I'm biased.
Yes. And remember, 10% off of your order when you use the coupon code COMICS. Well, this month, Shea, we're going to have some interesting discussions. Now, the first book we're going to be discussing is Makoto Yukimura's Planets. And then after that, we're going to get to an unusual collection by Sasaki Maki, and this is Ding Dong Circus. Now, before we do that, I don't know if you know, but as we're recording this today, and we're recording this on the 30th, we put up our Best of 2015 episode up on the Comics Alternative, and I don't know if you've had the chance to check that out yet, but this is where Andy and I, as we do every year, go over our 10 favorite comics of the previous year.
I saw that it went up, but I haven't gotten a chance to give it a listen yet. But I did see that in the kind of like preview image that comes up when it shows up on my Facebook that you guys talked about the Eternaut. So I'm excited to listen to that because I really like that book.
Yes, in fact, that was on my list, and even though I don't number, neither Andy nor I number things from 1 to 10, we just have what we consider our 10 favorites. If I had to pick a number 1 or 2, that would be somewhere around that area, toward the top of the list. So that's really good. But the reason I'm mentioning this is not just to advertise that episode, as good as I think it is, but just to say, unfortunately, there was no manga on that list. Although I do have to say that if the Adolf book that we discussed last month had come out in 2015, that would have definitely been in my top 10 because that was one of my favorite reads for this year. The Message to Adolf.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was thinking that the Adolf Hitler book. I was like, that came out this year.
No,
but,
yeah, not
Message to Hitler. Yeah,
not Suzuki's Hitler.
Yeah, I really liked Message to Adolf too. So I can understand why you would want to put that on your end of the year list.
Yeah, too bad it didn't come out this year, though. But again, the reason I'm mentioning this is, we're not doing kind of a best of in manga this year, but, something for us to consider for next December, because by that point we will have been doing this monthly manga series for over a year. Mm-hmm. And maybe you and I can pick out 2 or 3 of our favorite manga that was published in 2016.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy lists, so that seems like something that would be right up my alley.
Yes, so something to consider for next year. Also, before we get to our first book, we should let our listeners know, if they don't know it already, that Shea, you and I had, I don't know if you would call it an unfortunate coincidence when we put up our November episode where we discussed Shigeru Mizuki's Hitler. Mm-hmm. The day that episode went up is also the day that Mizuki passed away.
Yes, that was unfortunate, and I think we both really liked Mizuki's work, and the fact that we're not going to get any more new comics from him is it really is a shame.
Yeah, well, we can count on Drawn and Quarterly to put out more stuff. I mean, he has at least one book of his work coming out in 2016 from Drawn and Quarterly. So
they were planning to do a big line of his Kitaro stories. Mm-hmm. So there's, I think, 5 or 6 books in that series that they're planning on putting out at some point. So that'll be really cool to see come out.
Yes, but he did die, and he just happened to die the day of the podcast episode going up. In fact, I remember early that morning, right before I made that episode available, I read an email from you that you may have sent very early in the morning or late that night before that said, I don't know if this is true or not, but I saw something that Mizuki just died.
Yeah.
And then I checked it out, and lo and behold, he had. And soon after the episode went up, Andy Kunka emailed me and said, "Congratulations on your and Shea's latest manga episode. I think you probably killed Mizuki."
Well, It's probably more me than you because that earlier that week I had also written about his Showa series that went up, 4 or 5 days after the episode for Paste. So I was doing. It was a Mizuki heavy week, and then it kind of ended on that unfortunate note. So it was quite a. It was weird. It was a weird turn of events, to say the least.
Yeah, and let's hope that this doesn't happen again, that, the week that we discuss and then put up an episode of a living manga artist, that they die, because if they do, I'm going to start seeing a trend. And, Andy and I like to joke about our regular show, what we call the Comics Alternative Bump, because many of the titles we discuss tend to get a lot of award nods. And so we, like to feel self-important and say, oh, it's because we discussed it. But we don't want the Comics Alternative manga curse.
Yeah, that's... if it happens twice, I'll still consider it a coincidence. But 3 times, we might be... We might have something going. That we could monetize.
Okay, well, let's get into the first book we're going to be discussing for December, and this is Makoto Yukimura's Planets, and there's a reason why I stumbled over that title. Now, this is published by Dark Horse Books, and this is the first of, I think it's a 2-volume omnibus series. Now, let's start with the title, Shea, because it is spelled Planetes. And you and I were both, before we started to record, looking up some kind of information that would let us know one way or another how to pronounce this. Because since it ends with ES and not S, I was wondering, is it planets or is it planetes? And both of us found some information, but nothing definitive.
Yeah. When I first saw it, I assumed it was pronounced planetes, but like you said, we both kind of hopped up on the good old internet, and you found a weird pronunciation. The one I found on Wikipedia is just planets, and that seemed simpler. Mm-hmm. But you found one that was completely different from the one we thought it was, and the one this Wikipedia page is saying it is.
Right. Planets from the Greek, it means wanderer. And there's one site that I found that suggested that because it comes from the Greek, it's probably pronounced planetes or planetes, depending on the dialect. But I don't really know if this is an authoritative source at all. My guess is it's not. So, as with everything on the internet, you always have to wonder, do you trust it or not? So Shea and I have decided that for this episode, just to make things easier, we're going to call this Planets.
Yeah, hopefully we don't get some angry, some like linguist or like expert in ancient Greek is listening to this.
Or expert manga fans who absolutely know how this is pronounced. And if anyone is listening to this and they do have some kind of authoritative knowledge of the pronunciation of planets, then, hey, get in touch with us and let us know.
Yeah, we will welcome angry emails from... We like to be told we're wrong in some instances.
True, exactly. I'm all for being wrong.
Yeah, it's important to learn.
Yes. So now this is a title I was not familiar with Yukimura's work before Planets, but you had told me right before we started recording that you knew of some of his work before Planets.
Yeah, I'd seen some like people talk about Vinland Saga, and I'd seen a couple of they're like nice. I think Kodansha puts them out in these like nice hardcovers, and I'd seen a couple of them before, and I might have even flipped through them at some point. But I was kind of like tangentially aware of their existence, but I wasn't I didn't know too much about Yukimura, or what his cartooning was like, what kinds of things he was interested in as a writer. But yeah, I was kind of, I knew Vinland Saga was popular and people liked it, and so I think I recommended this to you just based solely on that.
Mm-hmm.
I knew his other work was was popular, and Dark Horse was bringing this back into print, so I said let's give it a shot.
Yeah, and Dark Horse has been doing this recently, and recently I don't mean just the past couple of months, but for the past 2 or 3 years, they've been putting out these large omnibus volumes of manga series that in many times have been out of print for a while. And we've talked about some of these on the show. Several months ago, you and I used one of these omnibus volumes of Oh My Goddess as a basis for one episode's discussion, or at least part of that episode's discussion. But they've done this with others as well. I know Astro Boy is another one that they've come out with in an omnibus edition. So there are a number of these, and I really appreciate. Oh, and also the Kurosawa Corpse Delivery Service that I think about 2 months ago we discussed that. So that was another one of their omnibus initiatives, I guess, collecting all of that stuff. Although Dark Horse is currently putting out the individual volumes of the Kurosawa Corpse Delivery Service, but they're doing the omnibus as well. So these are titles that aren't necessarily out of print, but they're just bringing them out in larger omnibus editions, which for some of these series that have many volumes kind of makes it easy for readers.
Yeah, I mean, I've got those... I think I've mentioned before, those Lone Wolf and Cub omnibus editions that are like, I think there's going to be like 10 of them, and you get 28, almost 30 volumes of regular volumes of manga in 10. And I have some of them, they're too big and you kind of lose some stuff in the spine, but I do like having these little cubes, because the Lone Wolf and Cub, they're the same height as the original paperbacks they put out, which were smaller than regular manga size, and so it ends up being like a cube because there's so many pages, and it's just really great to have just like a bookshelf full of these little cubes of Lone Wolf and Cub.
So it's kind of like what they're doing with the Astro Boys, because those are smaller as well and almost like a cube.
Yeah, I actually haven't seen any in real life, any of those Astro Boy ones, but it sounds like that they're similarly shaped. Which is great, it's like 800 pages of comics for $20, and Lone Wolf Cub is, great. It's a great comic, so you're getting a lot of bang for your buck.
Right. Now, this first volume of Planets, the first omnibus volume, is about 525 pages, around there.
Yeah, it's a good size.
Right. It's a good size, and it's divided into this volume 12 different story arcs. So, I mean, there is a lot packed into this, and I know that the original Planets, published in Japan, was 4 volumes long, and this originally ran from January of 1999 to January of 2004. So this is one of those series that has already run its course in the original language, but now we're getting this, at least with Dark Horse, repackaged in omnibus volumes. Now, how would you describe this comic to the uninitiated?
I was thinking about that, and kind of when I was reading the first 2 or 3 chapters, I saw a lot of comparisons to, or a lot of similarities, I should say, to that movie Gravity that came out a couple years ago. So if I had to describe it, I would say, like, if you've seen Gravity, it's Gravity for 1,000 pages.
Yeah. Have you seen Gravity?
I have. So for people who haven't, I would say it's like a hard sci-fi series about people who spend most of their time in floating around in space.
Yeah. See, I did not see Gravity for, I guess, maybe a couple of reasons. One, I just don't see as many first-run films as I used to. I just don't take the opportunity. But another reason, probably a more significant reason of why I haven't seen it, is Sandra Bullock.
Oh, well, I like Sandy B. So
Oh, really? See, there's something about her that gets on my nerves, and I've been able to stomach some of her movies, but I don't know. I just can't help. Every time I see her, I can't help but think of her in Speed. And in that film, it annoyed me to no end. She was just screaming, yelling, high-voiced almost the entire time.
see, for me, it's good that you brought up Speed, because for me, she's a lot like Keanu Reeves. She's often in movies that I do not like, but she's usually just really charming, and I enjoy watching her on screen. So,
Oh, well, see, Keanu Reeves is another one that annoys me.
I'm gonna firmly disagree with you on both. I'm a big fan of both of them as performers, but This isn't a movie podcast; it's a manga podcast.
That's true. So I won't mention the fact that Keanu Reeves has basically no, acting abilities at all. That he has just one delivery that he gives, regardless of the kind of film he's in.
Sometimes,
but I won't mention that though.
Sometimes that's all you need.
If you're the Duke, perhaps. Not Keanu Reeves. But again, we're not a movie podcast. We may want to be considered the Siskel and Ebert of comics podcast, but in fact, how many people would get that reference, that we're the Siskel and Ebert of comics podcast? I bet you some of our listeners don't know who Siskel and Ebert were.
They haven't been on air in a long time.
Yeah, well, both of them are dead now.
Yeah.
But but their show was at the movies.
Yeah, I don't think it. I think it was off the air, 10 years when I was born. So, well, maybe not then.
It was not. They were. I remember in the '90s them still being together, and then Siskel, I think he passed away either in late '90s or the early aughts.
Yeah, I think he passed away in the late '90s too. But they've been off the air for at least 15 years, at least.
Well, together, because Roger Ebert was on the show for the longest time. He had the cancer. Yeah. Okay, so we're getting morbid here. Let's get back to things that are a little more uplifting, such as Yukimura's planets. So anyway, yeah, I think the way that you describe... See, this is what Sandra Bullock does. It gets you, and especially Keanu Reeves, it gets you off onto tangents that are not productive.
That's true. That's true.
And I won't mention the fact that I was the one who initiated that. But no, you're right. Planets is science fiction manga, but it's not the kind of science fiction I think that you find more times than not in comics, not just manga, but I think all comics. And that is I don't know if you want to call it a soft kind of science fiction, some might want to, but let's say the more fantastical, psychological kind of sci-fi that it just seems to be much more prominent. But this, as you described it as hard science fiction, I was trying to describe this to my daughter earlier because I asked her if she had read this, and she had not. And so I said, it's something like, let's say, Star Trek, right? That it is, if you take scientific advancement as, to a certain level, let's say, 50 years from now, and the events that take place in this first volume of Planets is 2075 and 2076. And that's what I think the temporal markers are, because every now and again these story arcs begin with a date. And so, this is, I guess, from when it was written, about 60, 75 years into the future. So science by that point could be to where we are doing much more space exploration. And the three people that become four, but the three main people that begin the first narratives in Planets, they are Hachimaki, Yuri, and Fee. I guess you pronounce it Fee. It's Fee. These are, I guess we can call them space garbage people. They are, their job is to collect a lot of the debris that has been left in space, stranded in space by humans, for a variety of reasons, some because of accidents or just tossing off old material. Many times this is the debris that gets caught in the gravitational run of things, and so they become a danger to space travel because even something as small as a bolt, could seriously damage a ship. And so it's their job to go out in space around the Earth and the Moon and collect this debris. And the ship that they use I guess its designation is a DS-12, but they give it the name Toy Box. Mm-hmm. And so the two of the main characters, Hachimaki, who goes by usually Hachi, and Yuri, they're the guys who actually go out into or outside of the vessel into space to collect the stuff. And then Fee is the pilot of the toy box. And so this is their job. Now, later on, as we get to, I think it's, chapter 7, and the chapters are called phases, appropriately enough. But in phase 7, we're introduced to a fourth crew member, a female by the name of Tanabe. Mm-hmm. And so she becomes a member of this crew. But for the first half of this omnibus edition, it's Hachi, Yuri, and Fee, and much of it is not just the job that they perform or the jobs that they undergo, but their relationship. But we also get to see some of the backstory of some of these characters. So, for instance, the very first story in the collection, which is A Stardust Sky, we get a little of the backstory of Yuri. Mm-hmm. And how he came to work on the toy box and what space means to him. And we learned that he was, 7 years prior to the events in this first chapter?
7.
Something like that, yeah. He was traveling with his wife on a spaceship. And because at this point, space travel is fairly routine. It's not just astronauts who go up. It's businesses, it's leisure travel, and what have you. But there was a serious accident on the flight that Yuri and his wife were on, and as a result, she died, and he miraculously survived, and now he lives with having lost her. And so this really colors those first couple of chapters, his backstory. So we get a little background information on him, but I think, and tell me if I'm off base here, but it seems to me that the main character throughout most of the volume is Hachimaki.
I think that's something I noticed as well. For like the first maybe half of this omnibus, it's pretty much an ensemble kind of cast. But as it becomes less episodic and more this like serial about Hachimaki trying to get on the Jupiter, like the new mission to Jupiter, it becomes very much about him and becomes very centered on him. But there's like a noticeable shift when it happens. But certainly, I would say he's definitely the main character, at least for this volume.
And we also, we had mentioned Yuri's backstory, which involved his now dead wife. That's a family member, but it's actually Hachi's family that becomes most prominent, let's say of other characters' families, in this first volume, because Hachi's father, who is, a fairly well-known and well-respected pilot and astronaut, makes a few appearances in this volume. And then Hachi's mother, who is back on Earth, she's in some of these stories, as is Hachi's brother, who is younger and wants to be an astronaut someday. So we do see a lot of Hachi's family. So we know a lot about Hachi himself and what his dreams are. We learn fairly early on in one of the first stories that he dreams of eventually having enough money to where he can buy his own ship and then be his own boss. And then once we get, maybe into the third, maybe fourth story arc, I'm not sure, we learn about the Jupiter mention that you had mentioned, that you brought up. And he wants to be considered one of those people who go to Jupiter. And this is a big deal. And over the last half, arguably over the last maybe 2/3 of this first volume, the Jupiter mission becomes a very important storyline that is woven throughout many of these story arcs. Now, this is where I think much of the political feel of planets comes into play. Because, and we learned this fairly early on, that one of the reasons why humans are out in space as they are is that they have exhausted a number of the natural resources here on Earth. Mm-hmm. And so they colonize the moon, and they literally colonize. I mean, there are people who are living on the moon, and in fact, it's the second chapter, which is called A Girl from Beyond the Earth. Hachi meets someone who is, 14 years old, I think? And she's lived her entire life on the moon. She was born there, so she's never been to Earth. So, I mean, they have, humans have colonized the moon, and they're mining the moon for its resources. But then, as we get into this first volume, we learn that, well, eventually those resources are going to run out, and so they're planning this major mission to Jupiter because they're going to find resources that will basically be relatively, seemingly, I guess, limitless for humans to develop, to grow beyond, Earth and the solar system. So it's very ambitious. So on the one hand, there's this kind of positive, upbeat space exploration, yes, we can do it side of, going out and exploring new planets. On the other side of that coin, though, is the negative side of why we are out there, why humans are out in space. It's because, we need the resources. We're just consuming them. And, for needs that, are almost petty, for businesses, for them to make money. And this becomes an even more important storyline when we're introduced to the Space Defense League.
Mm-hmm. I think you mentioned something really important to kind of how I read the series, and it's kind of like down on this very like timeless idea of humans kind of consuming their resources until there's nothing left. And I think it's an idea that becomes increasingly relevant. But at the end of the day, it is a very optimistic book. I think it's similar to The Martian from earlier this year, which I thought was it's super optimistic, and it's all about how human beings can come together to do these great things, and with science, and that's the most important thing, is like scientific achievement, and it valorizes that, and it's all about people coming together. And I felt very similarly to this series, and in spite of that, those kinds of kind of pessimistic elements, or I guess realistic elements, it's a story about achieving great things with intellect and hard work, and instead of violence and fighting and conflict and stuff like that. It's like The Martian, I guess. It's not a book that kind of resonated with me a lot, but I did appreciate that.
Now, you're saying The Martian. What is that?
The Matt Damon movie from earlier this year. Which
was
okay.
A
pretty successful book before that, but I don't know. How did you feel about that kind of element of it? I mean, obviously it's a super like detailed, and I guess it's trying to be like a realistic portrayal of space. Like you mentioned, that the girl that Hachi meets on the moon, she's like one of 4 people who have been born there, mm-hmm. and he thinks she's older because she's so tall, because she grew up in this gravity it's so much lighter than Earth's gravity in it.
Right.
Those the way space kind of like affects the human body in very realistic ways is a really important part of the series.
Exactly. In fact, not only for the girl that Hachi meets on the moon, but also for Hachi himself, because there is more than one occasion where he has to go to the hospital. He has to visit doctors because, once it's an accident, he sprains or maybe breaks an ankle while, out in space on one of his disposal missions. But the doctor also notices at other times that he is not really taking care of himself. But these are things that they kind of expect astronauts to have, and so he needs to keep that in mind. Yeah, so I agree. Part of this book is the effects, not necessarily positive, of space exploration, what space can do, how it can affect human life. I don't know if I see it, because you were asking me if my take was similar to yours in being, I guess, more upbeat. I do see where where you're coming from there. I guess I don't see it near as much as, let's say, a retelling of Kennedy's New Frontier, let's say, where space exploration was a big part of that. I see this as a very tempered New Frontier, if you're going to look at it, positively in that way. I think that the premise itself suggests that there's something askew about space exploration because we're dealing with garbage collectors. We don't see the glorious side of space exploration, at least as spelled out traditionally, I guess, historically in, film, television, and all that. But we see people collecting the garbage that others have left behind. So I think right there in this series' very premise, we see, I don't want to say a dark, but maybe a darker or more tempered side to space exploration and technology and science.
I think it's a really mundane look. It's like space exploration has become, if like you look at or you think about kind of exploring space as this, as like walking upstairs. You have to get to the moon before you can get to Mars, and then before you need to get to Mars before you can get to Jupiter, and you need to take you need to take the first step so you can take the next step. To imagine this world where we've taken that first step and we have colonized the Mars, and I think they refer to these kind of compounds on the moon as cities. So it's reached that point where we're just like one step from where we are, and it's become normal. And so we're seeing that very mundane aspects of what space exploration would really be like. When you have a colony, you have to have these kinds of day-to-day normal maintenance things that we have in real life on Earth. It's not all fun adventure and bright colors, and every day you go to Nazi planet, and then you go to gangster planet, and then you go to Greek planet. It's not like that. I think you described it as a very tempered look at space exploration. I think that's a really good way to think about it, because it's not, wow, space exploration is going to be so cool and awesome and everything is going to be amazing if we can just get into space. It's like space exploration is cool and it is awesome, but also it's hard work, and there's so many, like, the minutia of it is really boring, and sometimes it's not going to be super fun, and the little details of it are going to be kind of miserable sometimes. It's going to be like any other job you have, except sometimes the environment's going to be really hazardous and dangerous. So it is like space is cool, but look at it. And I think that thinking of it as a tempered look at like how important space exploration is a really accurate way to kind of describe what it is, because it's not pessimistic. It's not like, oh, then there's no point in going into space. Space is lame. But it's not the kind of limitless optimism that you mentioned that was kind of prominent in like the mid to late 60s. It's a very realistic look at what this could be like.
Right, and I like you used the word mundane. I think that really puts a good finger on it in describing what this is, because it doesn't so much glorify. I mean, I do think I agree with you that ultimately it is kind of a positive take on science and space exploration. It's not completely gung ho, and it's not blindly giving the thumbs up to those kind of endeavors. But it does so through a realistic lens, an everyday lens. As you mentioned, the various steps, sometimes almost monotonous, that have to be taken in order to get where you ultimately want to go. And you're right. I don't think that this is, in the end, any kind of harsh critique of science and our ideas or any aspirations in space, because the potential. I mean, there are hints of this. As I mentioned earlier, we're polluting space. There's the garbage. There's the potential to exploit what's out there, mining the minerals, mining the gases and whatnot in order to, make money for businesses and the military industrial complex and all of that. I mean, I think that's there underneath the surface as well. But to me, this would be a critique on, let's say, an optimistic view of science if the Space Defense League were not shown as inept and at times almost as ridiculous as they are. On the one hand, there's something to be said for the Space Defense League because they do, at least at first, seem to have, these are like tree huggers in space, right? Or they're supposed to be. But I think that the way that Yukimura paints them is quite negative, and so we don't have anything but negative feelings about the Space Defense League. They're terrorists, and I found it interesting, and I'm curious to know your thoughts. When we get to a two-part story, this is in chapters 8 and 9, a black flower named Saki no Haka, the leader of this Space Defense League is Middle Eastern and a terrorist. And when I read that, I thought, okay, you're getting into stereotype ground here. That just seemed a little too sloppy to me. That maybe Yukimura was being a little heavy-handed in trying to paint this organization as unattractive, as terrorists. I think from the outset it's pretty clear that they're terrorists. The first time we kind of have any engagement with them is it's almost comical because Fee spends the whole chapter trying to smoke a cigarette and she's unable to because the Space Defense League keeps bombing these little areas that have been designated. Oh yeah, that when Fee, this is in chapter 3, a cigarette under starlight. Yeah, and in that chapter there's a pretty strong comedic undercurrent, but they are painted as pretty like black and white terrorists, and but I would be interested to know exactly when these were being produced, because they started in '99, so the stuff in like the kind of later stuff in this volume would have been like 2000, maybe 2001. So I don't know if it's not shocking to me that kind of there's the group that is obviously terror, like a terror group, is kind of coded in as like a Middle Eastern group or like an Arab group. It is kind of like, that's kind of, it is heavy-handed, like you said, and it's not very complicated, and it's kind of reductive, and it kind of plays into a lot of those stereotypes that people have. But at the same time, if you think about if this was produced, post 9/11, it's really not surprising to me that Yukimura was doing that, because that was kind of, and even up till today, we have a tendency to kind of associate with terrorism with a certain type of person, and it's not just Muslim people, but it's Muslim people who look like Muslim people are quote unquote supposed to look, right? And so, and people have always had that kind of Orientalism. But it got, I think everybody listening to this knows it got really, really bad after 9/11. Not just in the West, but in Japan too, that has its own kind of weird history with terrorism. They became the kind of, code word for terrorism is, it's a Muslim person. So I'm with you. I think that it's really heavy-handed. I think it's really. It's not something like I enjoy seeing. I think it's a stereotype that is kind of dumb and obviously offensive, but it's not surprising. It's
they did what, like 7 seasons of 24 based on that idea, that like Muslims are terrorists. I mean, Homeland is a show like that. Although in Homeland, they got someone to write Arabic graffiti on one of the walls that said "Homeland is racist."
Oh, really?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's kind of my read on it. I think it's really lame. I think it's a lazy choice, but it's not surprising. It really speaks to the kind of the anxieties that were prevalent in.
Yeah.
And
we should mention, this is only a very small part of this first volume, because what we're discussing now, this storyline where the Space Defense League is so prominent, and it has, and I can't remember the guy's name, but the leader of the group is Arabic. It's chapters 8 and 9, but the vast majority of the book, I mean, even when the Space Defense League is mentioned, there aren't the same kind of stereotypical links that are in there. So, I mean, this is not something that is woven throughout. But
see, that's interesting, because I'm just thinking about like what the timeline on when this was produced. So we see the Space Defense League pretty early, and we see the members of the Space Defense League are. I think he's supposed to be a white person, because it's a pretty like kind of multicultural cast.
The guy who leaves the briefcase?
Yeah, I read him as he was supposed to be a white, Western European or American character, but that would have been produced in like 1999, 2000. But by the time we get to where we're seeing the kind of leader is Arabic. Or we're supposed to read him as Arabic or some like vague Middle Eastern ethnicity, that would have been produced post 9/11. So it is interesting to think about like that kind of shift from when we first see them, and when that was produced, to when we see their kind of leadership, and when that was produced. And I hadn't really thought about that until you brought that up.
Yeah, and there may be something there in terms of when the latter part of this volume was originally produced, as, compared to the early stories. Although the idea of Arab as terrorist, was not new in 2001.
Oh no, but I think
it was out there. But I think it was much.
It became much more prominent.
Exactly. Yeah, it became a
just a
cultural trope. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think. I'm not sitting here saying like, wow, Yukimura was obviously like I hate Arab people now. But I think it's like a lot of things. He just kind of wrote it into the story without really examining it or being aware of it. It was just because it would have been something that was so everywhere and something that was so unquestioned at that point, that it's really easy to see how he could have just put it in the story without even thinking about it. Or being aware of that he was kind of perpetuating these very lazy stereotypes. But it is something that's interesting to think about it, and not that I think we'll ever get to the bottom of it. But.
Okay, so of these 12 stories in this first volume, is there one or even two that maybe really stood out for you?
That is tough. I think the early one that I just mentioned, where Fee spends the whole chapter trying to have a cigarette, is I think that one is probably my favorite. I think Yukimura does this kind of black comedy really well, but it's really most prominently on display in that chapter. And I'm not really that big a fan of hard sci-fi. I always have a problem of there's usually kind of a lack of really strong character moments or drama. It's sometimes interesting to read. Like here, I was really fascinated by these kind of technical aspects of it, and that was really interesting to me. But I think Planets suffers from that same kind of problem that I usually find, where there just wasn't enough drama for me. It really emphasized or privileged those kind of technical accuracy over being a dramatic or compelling story. But I think that one where Fee's just trying to have a cigarette, she's just trying to have a cigarette. It's something, I used to be a smoker. It's something I can really relate to. I think it's genuinely funny. I think it's the best glimpse of her as a character that we see throughout the book. and it's the one that's just the lightest on those technical aspects. And so for me, that was the one that really, really worked best by itself. What about you? Was there one in particular that you kind of felt was a little standout?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple, and one of them is the one you mentioned, A Cigarette Under Starlight. I mean, I really enjoyed that one as well for the comedy, and we did get to see the character Fee in ways that we didn't get to see her in any of the other stories. Another one of the chapters that stood out to me is the sixth one, Running Man, and this is when we're introduced to Hachi's father. Now, he had been mentioned previously, I think the story, Scenery for a Rocket. This is when Hachi goes home, because of some medical reasons. He goes home for a while, and, well, actually, it's because, isn't it because that their ship has been totaled because of Fee?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's it. Yeah, that's why he and Hachi and Yuri are back on Earth. And so Hachi takes Yuri to, who is Russian. At first I didn't know that he was Russian, although the name should tell me something. But it's in the chapter Scenery for a Rocket that we learned that, or at least that I first noticed, that Yuri was Russian. And then Hachi takes him to his home during the winter in Japan, and so we're introduced to Hachi's family, the mother and younger brother, and Hachi's father is mentioned, but we don't see him until chapter 6. And in Running Man, this is when we really get a lot of detail on this Jupiter mission, and the owner of the corporation that is funding this endeavor in the ship, especially, which is, supposed to be the most technically advanced ship ever created. He is trying to track down Hachi's father because this businessman, whose name escapes me, feels that Hachi's father is the only one who could really pilot this ship. And so much of this chapter is spent with Hachi's father trying to run away and say no to this businessman, and the businessman trying to track down Hachi's father. But we also get to see a bit of the relationship between Hachi and his father. And it's here where I think I see this first volume of the Planet's Omnibus in a different way than you do, because you mentioned earlier, outside of the Cigarette Under Starlight story, that Yukimura tends to privilege the technical scientific part of his narrative over, let's say, character and similar, I guess, narrative elements. I tend to disagree. I think that, the technical scientific info, doodads, ins and outs, that's all there. But I think one of the things that stands out to me about Planets is that you see a lot of character development. This is very character-driven, especially when it comes to relationships. Now, we have stories like A Stardust Sky and then A Cigarette Under Starlight, which really showcases one particular character, Yuri and Fee, respectively. But most of these other stories, it's relationships. So whether it be between Hachi and his father, or Hachi and Fee, or Hachi and the newer crew member Tanabe, I think that the way that these people interact, part of it is comedic, much of it is dramatic, and we get to see individual character through relationships. And that's what I appreciated about Planets, is that the character-driven aspect. Because it seemed to me, I went into this thinking, okay, this could be a science-heavy manga. I didn't feel that way. I think that this was more character-driven than otherwise. Did you not see that?
No, I didn't mean to say that, like, there's really no character moments or anything like that. It's definitely, like, in terms of hard sci-fi, it's not the worst I've seen. It definitely does a much better job of letting us see the character and seeing them through action and seeing them through how they engage with other people than others. And I actually enjoyed the book. It's just hard sci-fi is not. I think there are moments of where Yukimura's like need to explain something or get into some technical aspect really detracts from just like a scene, or it slows down a page and things like that. And so I don't think, I think he does do a much better job of balancing those two than a lot of the people who tend to work in that kind of subgenre of sci-fi that he's working in. But I think there's just a couple moments where he comes right up to these great scenes and it's just lessen it just a little bit, or by just too much dialogue or something like that.
Okay, I can see where you're coming from now. That makes sense to me, because there are a few of those moments where it's almost as if the story pauses, even momentarily, in order to give us a little bit of scientific context.
Yeah, it just there are for me too many moments where it just slows down too much. Because it feels a need to kind of explain or explore these very technical, and from what I understand, very like scientifically realistic aspects of the kind of world that it's working in. So I don't think those make it a bad book or an unenjoyable book. I just think they keep it from hitting that next level of quality. They detract from it just a little too much.
Well, let me ask you, you mentioned that you like it well enough, but do you like this well enough to get the next omnibus volume?
Maybe. I really enjoy Fee as a character, and I really enjoy Yuri as a character. I know we kind of talked about how Hachi is kind of the de facto lead of the trio, but I really don't enjoy him too much. There are those really fun moments where he's very, very much like a kind of typical shonen manga lead character. He's a young boy who's very driven. There was a couple scenes that could have been lifted directly out of something like Naruto or even Dragon Ball. Where he's just like, I'm going to be the best at this thing, or I'm going to be the first to do this thing just because I'm going to work harder, and this overwhelming desire is going to be the thing that gets him into his dreams, not necessarily a natural aptitude or he's smarter or stronger or better than anyone else. He's just going to work harder. He's going to want it more. That felt very shonen to me, and I really do enjoy that character archetype. But there's just way too many scenes of him just being just really like dumb and stubborn and bullheaded, and I preferred other characters to him.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's only one more of these, so I would be willing to check it out just to see kind of how it concludes and how everything wraps up. And I really do. We haven't talked about it much, but I really like how Yukimura draws stuff. The way he draws people is sometimes kind of not to my liking. It's sometimes the way he draws eyes and noses is just a little too cartoonish for me, within the kind of context of the story and the rest of the things he draws. But the way he draws the kind of machinery and the way he draws the moon is really cool, and the way he draws the interior spaces of these kind of colonized cities on the moon is really cool. So I really did enjoy reading it. Just for that alone was just really interesting to see.
That's a good point about his art, because and I didn't have a problem with it, but I see where you're coming from. That not in every instance, but I think more times than not, his illustrations of people are more minimal, at times even cartoonish. I think you used that word. When compared to, I wouldn't call it cartoony, but relatively speaking, his humors are a little more cartoon-ish when compared to the setting surrounding them, whether it be the moon or the spaceships or other technology that surrounds them. That seems to be much more detailed, and the people are a little more simplified. But again, not in every instance. There's some cases where we do see very fine detail in rendering the human face. In fact, I'm looking at what is the page number? And I'm looking at a PDF. You and I both have PDFs that we're reading from right now. And I think this is page 30, and there is an illustration of Yuri where we get a close-up of his face. And it's much more detailed, heavier use of shadows than we get with most other renderings of the people in the story. So there are occasions where I think the art is a little more detailed. But you are right that it seems like more times than not, the people are drawn a little more simplistically.
Mm-hmm. But just stuff like, I'm looking back at the earlier, the first few pages in that first chapter in that. I mean, that flashback transition where Yukimura kind of takes one larger panel and he kind of splits it up into, it's hard to describe, I guess, but on page 22, where it's like a large square, and then as it gets farther to the left, it becomes smaller panels. There's this interesting transitional quality that I like for flashbacks. I think it works well as a storytelling tool, and it looks,
I see what you're talking about.
Yeah. I wish I could explain that better for people who haven't seen this, but it does.
No, I like this because this is Yukimura indicating through a break in panel usage, or at least the panel rhythms, that Yuri is thinking back, or he's having a flashback, or we as readers are now privy to a previous part of his life. Because, let me see, and this is around that time. So you said it was on page, 22, so this must be about 20 or so, where Hachi is asking Yuri about what's going on and why he's feeling the way he is. And Yuri makes a comment about something happening a couple of years ago. And we get this panel breakdown that you had mentioned. And then, we see this flashback a couple of pages later where he is, he's definitely been in an accident. We see that Yuri's head is bandaged and his arm is in a cast in a sling. And he's standing over the effects of his now dead wife. And so we're brought into that past through that kind of panel layout, and then we're taken out of that past remembrance through a similar kind of shift in panel layout.
Yeah, I see where you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciated that. So, yeah, I'm with you. I may get the next volume of Planets. I liked it well enough. I mean, I'm glad we read it.
Yeah, I like. We've talked about this before, but I like using the podcast as an excuse to read things that that I'm not familiar with, or that I may in other contexts be hesitant to kind of give a shot to. It's a good excuse to explore genres that I don't have a lot of experience with, and cartoonists that I'm not familiar with. So yeah, I mean, there have been some books we've talked about that I haven't really quite enjoyed so much, but I've liked getting the opportunity to read all of them. So I'm definitely with you on Planets. I'm glad we chose this. I'm glad we talked about it.
I am too. So that was Planets by Makoto Yukimura. And if you want to take a break right now from Manga Talk and go get a cup of coffee, well, we hope that coffee is Just Coffee Co-op Coffee. They're a sponsor of our show. If you go to justcoffee.coop, you'll see a wide variety of coffees, teas, and they even have chocolates. As we told you at the top of the show, all of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade grown, and organic certified. Get your coffee there, and upon checkout, make sure you use the coupon code COMICS. That'll give you 10% off of your order. Can you beat that? Well, actually you can, because shipping is free as well. So go to Just Coffee Co-op. That's justcoffee.coop. It's a great place to get caffeinated. So, let's transition into the second title we're discussing this month, and that is Sasaki Maki's Ding Dong Circus.
Yes, this was I think we could both agree it was a weird book.
Yes.
Probably the weirdest we've talked about so far.
Yeah, it's funny. You're using the word weird. I would say the most unusual.
It
definitely.
is. I don't want me saying weird to sound like a pejorative because
Right.
I've written about this. I wrote about this book earlier this month for the AV Club. I was the one who recommended this book. I really, really, really liked the book, but it is weird. It's undeniably weird. But I don't want people to get the wrong idea and think I'm criticizing it when I use that word.
See, you don't tell me this stuff. You don't tell me, hey, I just wrote a piece for AV Club on Ding Dong Circus that we're going to discuss in a couple of weeks. Why didn't you let me know?
I'm like a bad at self-promotion, I guess.
You should let me know, because I know that one of my bad habits is, although some people may consider it a good habit, is not checking like social media or keeping up with, let's say, comics news as I should, being a comics podcaster. I just kind of let that stuff slip. So, if I kept up with that on a more regular basis, I would have discovered your name, but I didn't. At the same time, though, you can let me know when you publish something on this. So what did you have to say about Ding Dong Circus for AV Club? Was that like a dry run for our podcast episode?
No, it was... so the AV Club, they're like 500-word capsule reviews, and I feel like I've finally gotten the hang of writing in that kind of format, and the last couple of things I've written for them, I feel pretty confident about, and I do enjoy getting in and out and just digging into a book, as without a lot of fluff. But for this, it comes with all of the stuff that Ryan Holmberg has translated, like Saichi Hayashi's Flowering Harbor and Golden Paul and Other Stories, and a couple other things he did for like Shigeru Sugiura's Last of the Mohicans for Picture Box, and I can never remember. He did another book for Breakdown Press. He did Flowering Harbor, and then another book that I cannot remember the name of.
Yeah, and we should mention that this is published by Breakdown Press. In fact, this was just released, I think, this month in December.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And same thing with Planets. I don't think we mentioned that Planets, that first volume of the Omnibus, came out this month as well.
Yeah, we should have done that. But so he's done a couple, and he did Trash Market. He also translated Trash Market.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And he writes when he usually puts these books out, he has a pretty good size essay that he puts up on the Comics Journal, and he's like a historian, and a lot of the books for Breakdown Press have been put out in kind of conjunction with, I think they're like Centers for Japanese Studies in England, I think. And so he's kind of a historian. And I was really upset to not have an essay by him in this book, because there usually is. But it includes an essay by Sasaki Maki, where he talks about working on these comics and working at Garo, and looking at comics as... people usually understand comics as these kind of linear transitions between panels, or at least they're supposed to be, or they expect there to be a temporal relationship between panels.
Right.
But he was looking at it as it could be like poetry, where there didn't need to necessarily be a literal relationship between the two, as long as there's kind of like an associative relationship. It worked in that way, and so I kind of wrote about how you need to take this book on its own terms, and you kind of need to see them as poetry. Because if you look at them as you're supposed to read them like they're narratives, they really, really don't work at all. But if you look at them as just these kind of montages where you're being shown a series of images that are supposed to have some sort of relationship, you kind of associate this thing with that thing in some way. I think they really do work, and they are enjoyable, and they're really interesting to kind of read and think about. And I singled out I can't remember the name. It's like the Vietnam Problem, I think is the name of it, where it looks like he kind of photocopied like
the Vietnam debate.
It's the Vietnam debate, where it looks like he kind of his aesthetic is usually like very stylized, very cartoony, but in this it looked like he kind of photocopied stock photos of like Japanese men and women just kind of smiling and talking around.
And they're not, and not even complete sentences, but these are phrases and words that would probably at the time seem to keep cropping up during any kind of discussion of the Vietnam War.
Exactly. I think I described them as kind of Burroughsian. They were, there's no punctuation. I don't think there's capitalization. And they look like just kind of word salad of these kind of very, at the time, buzzwords that kept cropping up. And it's, when I first kind of had heard about this book a while back, I had heard about kind of Sasaki Maki doing these détournements, which is a kind of a recontextualization of imagery. And so I wrote about that story, or that kind of story in quotes, in particular because I think it is the kind of apotheosis of his ethos as a cartoonist. It is this non-narrative, very political, very complex comic that kind of does for me, I think, is the kind of ultimate in following through with what his intent was supposed to be.
Right. Now we should mention here that the contents of Ding Dong Circus and other stories is almost, but not quite completely, made up of stories that he originally published in the alternative manga magazine Gado between 1967 and 1971, although there's a piece here, The Bad Moon, which is the last comics entry in this collection. There's his essay that follows. That, let me see, this, I'm looking at the table of contents, and it appeared somewhere else, not in Gado, but there are 15 different comic stories, and as you'd mentioned, with the vast majority of these, any idea of story, toss it out the window. And in fact, you'd mentioned the editor-translator, Ryan Holmberg. I did see his piece in the Comics Journal online. And, at one point, he made reference to Maki's style of collage storytelling. And maybe this is more quibbling than anything. I mean, collage, definitely. Storytelling, I wouldn't have used that word for the very reasons that you pointed out, Shea, in that with the exception of 2, maybe 3 of these pieces, looking at it as story doesn't make sense. And so I would suggest why even call it story? Why call it narrative? Because, when it comes right down to it, a story is a series of events where there is some kind of linkage. There's both a time-based or temporal and also a causation link. Mm-hmm. And with comics, those temporal and causation links take place between panels, where what happens in one panel is linked in some way and in some time with what happens in the next one, and those are based on the previous panel. And again, with the exception of 2 or 3 of these pieces in this collection, that's not the case. And so if you're looking for story in these, it's not going to work. You're going to be frustrated. So that's why I wondered why Holmberg spoke broadly of collage storytelling. Now, some of these are like stories. So, for instance, the second piece here, The Ballad of Henri and Anne, yeah, I guess. Definitely The Town Horse, I think, is a discernible story. There is a narrative going on here. And Ding Dong Circus, and not just because it's a title piece, but it was my favorite. That had narrative elements to it as well. But most of the other entries here, if you're looking for some kind of causation between and among panels, that these things are happening at about the same time, that there's some kind of relationship with these images, you're going to be very, very frustrated in trying to make sense of that.
Yeah, there's like you said, there was like 2 or 3, and but even those are they're very. I hesitate to use the word surreal because I think that is a descriptor that's usually overused, but they are very bizarre. like his other comics, you're not supposed to read the images literally. They're supposed to be these kind of visual metaphors for other things that kind of interlock with these other visual metaphors, and so even the narrative ones are they're very difficult to parse, and you have to stop and think about kind of what you just read and what you're supposed to get from it. And I did actually really appreciate that from Maki, because he's working in a style. He has a very unusual, it's a very immediate, very raw style. I think he works directly in pen.
And it has a pop art feel to it.
Yes, it's very. I think pop art is a really good way to describe the kind of way he draws. Mm-hmm. But even just kind of his line it's very loose. It's very immediate. It feels like it's just kind of like pouring out of his unconscious, and he just has to get it down on paper. There's no second drafts, anything like that. And I really appreciated that he was not just working in an unusual aesthetic, but he's working in an unusual kind of, again, storytelling in quotes. But he's also interested in doing different things with comics, not just in like the thing we usually see with kind of formalist comics, where they're, well, here are weird, panel designs. Ooh, this comic's like a cube or like a box full of different artifacts. He's trying to do different things with the medium in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before. And so I really appreciated that. And I really appreciated Holmberg and Breakdown Press bringing this into print, because I think it is, I personally really enjoyed reading it and thinking about it. And even now I like talking about it.
Right.
But as from a historical context, I think it's a really important work to have available.
And you said just a second ago, I enjoyed reading it, and I think we definitely read this book, but we read it in a way that we don't read other things, or probably the most things that we would associate the word read with. And this is where the earlier descriptive that you used, poetry, I think comes into play here. And of course, we read poetry, but we're not reading the stories for the most part in Ding Dong Circus as stories, right? Where there is a causal temporal link between and among panels, that there is some kind of narrative being told on some level. This is much more like poetry, and with poetry, you're dealing more with feeling. And I know that there are poems that are more narrative based, but I'm talking about those that are heavily relied on imagery, on feeling. Now, obviously, we have imagery in the comics here, literal images, but I'm talking about the repetition of certain things, of certain elements that keep coming up again and again. And in poetry, it could be the repetition or the frequent use of certain words or references to a sense, maybe with variation that keep cropping up again and again, that becomes something like, let's say in music, as a leitmotif, right? And so you have something similar going on in Ding Dong Circus, like the imagery in poetry, like the leitmotif in music. And I'm looking at one example of this kind of strange kind of quote-unquote storytelling, even though I don't think that's an appropriate word. And this is Seaside Town. And if you look through Seaside Town, and flip through the pages, and it's a relatively short entry, it's really difficult to make sense of things. So, for instance, if you read Seaside Town and you put it down and you try to describe what you just read to a friend as to what happened, you probably couldn't. What you'd end up doing is describing various images that kept coming up again and again. So in Seaside Town, you have this image of running babies that keep coming up again and again. You also have the image of a soldier that is repeated. You have the image of a guy with a hat of some sort, like a fedora or a bowler hat, that keeps cropping up. and an elephant, or even sometimes a person with a ball and chain around his or its leg, dancing mummies. And this sounds weird. But if you read Seaside Town, you'll see what I'm referring to here. And I think many of these stories are like that, where within each, and again, story loosely, within each of these entries, almost all of them originally appearing in Gato, there are certain images that are repeated, and sometimes repeated with variation. Now, I don't want to suggest that the repetition of those images provides any kind of solid meaning. I think it provides some meaning. I think it's very fluid and thin at times, but that's okay. That's the kind of comic that this is. Again, much more like poetry. But there are also certain images that are woven among the various stories. It seems to me that Maki likes to use certain images, certain characters, certain things, certain visuals again and again. And one of those is, I guess we could call it the silhouette of a wolf. Do you remember that coming up in a variety of these installments?
Yeah. He definitely has these, I think leitmotif is, which you mentioned a few minutes ago, is a really good way to describe what he does. These kind of like brief kind of snippets that just keep popping up over and over, not just in one story, but across multiple stories. Or again, stories in quotes, loosely defined.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's like a good way to think about it is as a leitmotif, as this kind of common thread that stitches all of these works together.
And it's that kind of loose cohesion, I think, that makes this book so enjoyable. But again, I want to qualify enjoyable, because you don't enjoy it just as you don't read it like you do other comics. Mm-hmm. In this talk about poetry and music and leitmotif, I want to reference the essay that appears in this volume. And I was about to say in the back, but depending on how you pick up the book, because you do read this or consume it or engage with it, let's say, as you would traditional Japanese manga from what we would consider from back to front and from right to left. But with the essay, you do read it from left to right. Now, this essay is called Still a Cartoonist, and on page... Oh, I just lost it. Oh, yes. Okay, so this is on lower Roman numeral 12. He described in this essay, Still a Cartoonist, the vast majority of this is him going over his biography, his history in comics. And so it's interesting on that level. But then on page Roman numeral 12, he goes into a little detail about what he's attempting to do with his comic. And this gets to what you and I have been discussing, Shea. He says at one point, and this is in that third paragraph about the middle of the page, panels were arranged, his work, not to express the passage of time or cause and effect relations between things. Instead, like in a poem where words are made resonant with one another, I thought, why can't panels in comics be made to commune with one another so that they create a strange effect upon the viewer, a kind of chemistry, to put it metaphorically? It's not like I was out to reject the existing grammar of comics in its entirety. When I wanted to clearly tell a story, like in The Ballad of Henri and Anne or The Town Horse, I resorted to the original function of panels. I wanted to think about the medium of comics as something more open. I wanted comics making to be a world in which anything goes. And I think that those two brief paragraphs go a long way of describing what you can expect with Ding Dong Circus and other stories.
Mm-hmm. I think that essay is key, and I really do like that Holmberg includes those essays because all the ones he's done for D&Q, he did Trash Mercury for D&Q, and the three he did for Picture Box, and the stuff he's done for Breakdown has been stuff that has been out of print. If it was ever in print in English, it's been out of print for a very long time. It's stuff that came out of a context that not only most American comic readers, but most manga readers, even in Japan, are not even going to be, they're not going to have the knowledge to kind of properly contextualize. And so I like that he includes those essays from the cartoonist, and I like that he usually includes an essay from him that serves as this really good guide for what you're going to read or what you've just read, that allows you to understand the context in which they were produced and the context in which they were published. And I think Maki's essay in this is key to kind of really understanding, because if you don't understand that he's not trying to write his comics with temporal relationships, if it's not about that, if it's more about associative relationships or kind of these abstract relationships between images, it's going to seem like gibberish to you. Because if you don't understand that and you try to read them like narrative comics, they are going to not make any sense. And they're not supposed to make sense if you like that, because they're not designed to function in that way. So I totally agree that essay that you just read from is really enlightening, and it's really illuminating. And I'm glad that it was included in this.
Yeah, although it would have been nice to have seen an essay by Holmberg as well in this.
Yeah, I always enjoy those. You know, I think I've got all of the ones you did for Picture Box, and I don't think I read the Masahiko Matsumoto is the guy. I can't remember. Why can't I remember the name of that book? I really wanted to read that because it was Matsumoto is someone who developed not manga and not gekiga, but komaga, which is more interested, I think, if I'm remembering Holmberg's essay about it correctly, Matsumoto developed komaga, which means panel pictures, I think, as a style of comics that was more interested in the temporal relationships. It was so interested in the temporal relationships that it kind of was uninterested in traditional narrative, like plot and character and stuff. And so it's kind of the opposite of Maki's. It takes it so far in the other direction that it also loses kind of plot and character. And so I was interested in getting a hold of that as well. But Homer is, I think I called him an angel the other day. He really is doing. I have really enjoyed. Like, I genuinely enjoyed all of these works that he's done. He's the reason I even know who Saichi Hayashi is, and Hayashi is one of my favorite cartoonists now. And his translation of Last of the Mohicans, it's a very, very weird, surreal pop art comic that's similar to this in that you sometimes don't know what to make of it, and you sometimes get the feeling that you're supposed to not know what to make of it. But that's a really good book, and he translated Osamu Tezuka's Mysterious Underground Men, which is it's not comparable to kind of some of the later, more famous Tezuka works, but as a piece of like history, it's really fascinating to look at Tezuka and to look at something that I think was the second comic he ever did, and to look at how it really is an example of like you're watching the development of modern manga when you read that book. And so I really appreciate the work Holmberg is doing, not just obviously from a historical perspective, but it's also work that I think is really fun. It's really fun to read. It's really interesting to read.
Yeah, and it does help with context, as you pointed out. Before we leave Ding Dong Circus, I have to say that one of the things that I was reminded of in reading, quote-unquote reading, Ding Dong Circus, is my experience with reading Gertrude Stein, and specifically Tender Buttons. That's another strange form of literature in that it's not poetry, it's not really prose, definitely not story, but what is it? It's just something else entirely. So you take it for what it does and then try to find some kind of meaning and appreciation on those grounds. And I think the same thing can be said of Maki's Ding Dong Circus.
I'm not familiar with that Stein, but I am familiar with, I can't remember the name of the poem, but she did a recording of it herself, and it's just her saying like the same three words over and over and over and over again for like 3 minutes. I can't remember the name, but I remember reading about it, and she said it was her attempt to do like poetic or like oral cubism. So I definitely know what you're talking about.
Yeah, although with The difference is that with Gertrude Stein, she's someone who I appreciate, but I don't enjoy. I mean, and there's a difference. Now, if I want to enjoy something that was heavily influenced by the kind of stuff that Gertrude Stein was doing, then I'll read Hemingway and Faulkner. But with Gertrude Stein, you get what Hemingway and Faulkner were doing, but boiled down to its bare essence, really, with that experimentation. But anyway, there's a lot of experimenting going on here in Ding Dong Circus, and I'm glad you recommended this because you were the one, Shea, who suggested that we take a look at this. This is also the very first time on the podcast, manga episode or otherwise, that we have discussed a book by Breakdown Press.
That is true, and I think it was the first Breakdown Press Oh no, I read the Saichi Hashi. So it's the second. It's the second Breakdown Press book, but yeah, they do really, really good stuff.
Yeah,
I'm excited to read more from them, and I'm excited to see them continue their relationship with Ryan Holmberg.
Yep. So, Shea, for December, we talked about two very different works of manga. We started off with Makoto Yukimura's Planets, or if you would prefer, Planetes or Planetes. We're calling it Planets. And then after that, we looked at an unusual work of manga, a collection, Ding Dong Circus and Other Stories, by Sasaki Maki, and two very different works, but both enjoyable in their own ways. And if you want to find great works of manga like this, you would do well to visit the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to their website, dcbservice.com, you'll find that they're a great place to find manga and pre-order, or you can use their sister company's website, instocktrades.com. There you're going to find comics, including manga, that have already been published. So whether it's instocktrade.com or DCB Service, check them out. A great place to get your funny books. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of manga that you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to leave us an email, you can email both of us, or Derek and Andy, or Derek and any combination of the co-hosts, at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly at Shea@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, where can they reach you?
Derek@comicsalternative.com. You know, you can also find us on Twitter. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs, but we're also elsewhere in the social media sphere. You can find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, on Pinterest, and on YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. And you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we publish on our blog. And that's at the website, comicsalternative.com. Well, Shea, when this show goes up, it will be the very last day of 2015. Do you have any big plans for New Year's Eve?
I do not. I'm not a very festive person. I'm a very boring person. I don't have any plans at all.
Stay inside and read manga.
I will probably spend some time with my girlfriend, but other than that, yes, that sounds like a great way to spend my day, is just staying inside and reading some manga.
Yeah, you know, being there with your loved one, reading a little manga, and what else do you need? A jug of wine and thou, right?
Yeah, sounds like a good plan to me.
Yes, yeah, I'm where you are. I'm just going to stay inside and probably do some reading. So we hope that you guys listening to the show have a wonderful New Year's Eve and an even better 2016. And Shea and I will catch you on the other side of the new year. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you next month.